Some lives aren't meant to be found, because finding them changes everything. The wind didn't howl across the frozen plain. It scraped, like metal dragged over glass, sharp enough to make Ethan Cole's teeth clench behind his cracked visor as he adjusted the thermal dial on his suit. Watching the numbers struggle to hold at -60 degrees Fahrenheit, while frost crept along the edges of his display, each breath inside his helmet slow and controlled, each step deliberate as his boots sank into the crusted ice with a hollow crunch that echoed too far in the open silence. He wasn't supposed to be here, not this far. Beyond map territory, not on a world that had swallowed 3 survey teams without leaving so much as a distress ping. But scavenging wasn't about comfort, it was about risk, and risk paid better than memory, and memory was the one thing he was trying to outrun when the sound came again. Faint, irregular, not mechanical, not wind, something softer, almost like a knock buried beneath layers of ice, and Ethan froze mid-step, heart rate spiking just enough to trigger a warning blink across his HUD as he turned slowly, scanning the flat expanse of white and blue shadows, his gloved hand drifting instinctively toward the sidearm at his hip, though he didn't draw it. Not yet, because whatever made that sound wasn't moving fast, wasn't hunting, it was waiting, and that was worse. He crouched, brushing away the top layer of frost with slow, careful motions, revealing a patch of translucent ice beneath, and there it was again. A dull tap, then another, uneven, like a heartbeat struggling to stay steady. And for a moment he just stared at it, at the faint silhouette beneath the surface, something curled, something small, something that should not have been alive in temperatures that could shut down a suit in minutes. And his jaw tightened as a memory pushed forward uninvited. A different world, a different sky burning orange. The sound of distant alarms and the knowledge that alien contact had never meant anything good for people like him. Walk away, he muttered under his breath, voice dry in the recycled air, because this wasn't his problem, because whatever was down there wasn't human, because he had learned the hard way that saving the wrong life could cost you everything. And yet his hands didn't listen, already reaching for the compact plasma cutter strapped to his thigh, already adjusting the output to low so it wouldn't fracture the ice too violently, already tracing a careful line around the shape beneath as steam hissed softly into the frozen air. The surface cracked with a brittle sound, splitting just enough for him to pry it open, and when he did, the cold seemed to deepen, as if the world itself inhaled, revealing her in fragments first, pale blue skin dulled by frost, hair like frozen silver strands clinging to her face, and restraints, sleek, metallic bands locked around her wrists and ankles, humming faintly with a power signature far too advanced for a simple crash survivor. And Ethan's breath caught, not from the cold this time, but from the realization settling in his chest as he reached down, brushing ice away from her cheek with a gloved thumb and feeling the faintest flicker of warmth beneath the surface. She wasn't just stranded, she had been left here, deliberately. And when her eyes opened, slow, unfocused at first before sharpening into a piercing violet glow that locked onto his visor with startling clarity, there was no fear in them, no confusion, only a quiet, unyielding awareness, and for a second neither of them moved. The wind scraping across the ice around them, the silence, stretching thin between two worlds that were never meant to meet like this. And then she spoke, her voice barely more than a breath, but steady despite the cold. The translator in his suit struggling for half a second before rendering the words into something he could understand. You should not have found me, human. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound fogging his visor as he glanced at the restraints, then back at her eyes. Something heavy settling behind his ribs, because he already knew this wasn't a rescue. This was the beginning of something far worse, and still, he didn't let go. The cutter cooled with a soft hiss as Ethan shut it off, the faint glow fading back into the steel gray of his glove while the wind scraped harder across the exposed opening, tugging at the loose edges of fractured ice as if trying to reclaim what he had just uncovered. And for a moment he just knelt there, one knee pressed into the frozen ground, staring at her as her words settled into something heavier than the cold, something that lingered in the silence between them. He had heard that tone before, not fear, not gratitude, but certainty, the kind that came from someone who understood consequences far beyond the moment, and it made the muscles in his jaw tighten as he shifted his weight and reached toward the restraints encircling her wrists, the surface smooth, seamless, and humming faintly with a low frequency that his suit immediately flagged as unknown technology, far cleaner and more deliberate than anything a crash survivor would be wearing, which only confirmed what his instincts had already been telling him, that she had not ended up here by accident. You were locked in, he said, his voice steady but low, as if the wind itself might carry the words too far, and her eyes followed his movement, tracking his hand with quiet precision. No panic, no attempt to pull away, only that same measured awareness that made it difficult to read her. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a slight tremor now, not from fear but from the strain of surviving in a place that should have already taken her life, not locked and left. And the distinction hung there, subtle but unmistakable, as Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the inside of his visor while his mind moved through the implications with the same disciplined clarity that had once kept him alive in situations just as uncertain. He should have stepped back then, should have sealed the ice and walked away before whatever had put her here came back to check the job was done, because nothing about this was random, nothing about this was safe. And yet his hand did not withdraw, instead shifting to the side of her neck, where his glove pressed lightly against her skin, the suit sensors adjusting automatically, scanning for life signs. And there it was, faint but present, a rhythm uneven but persistent, a heartbeat that refused to stop even when everything around it demanded that it should. And something in that stubbornness pulled at him in a way he did not want to examine too closely. "You are losing heat fast," he said, more to the data scrolling across his display than to her, already reaching behind his shoulder to unclip the compact thermal wrap from his pack, the material unfolding with a quiet snap as he positioned it around her frame, careful of the restraints, careful of the fragile balance that was keeping her conscious. And for the first time her expression shifted, not much, just a slight narrowing of her eyes as she watched him work, as if trying to understand a pattern that did not match anything she had been taught. "You do not know what I am," she said, softer now, and Ethan let out a short breath that might have been a laugh if it had not been so tired, shaking his head once as he secured the final clasp and felt the temperature around her begin to stabilize. "No," he replied, his voice quieter than before, "but I know what happens if I leave you here." And that was the truth he could not ignore, not after everything, not after the things he had already chosen to walk away from. The wind shifted again, stronger this time, carrying with it a distant vibration that did not belong to the natural rhythm of the storm, something deeper, mechanical, and Ethan's gaze snapped upward instinctively, scanning the horizon through layers of drifting ice particles, his display flickering as it tried to isolate the source. And there, just at the edge of detection, a faint signature pulsed against the static, moving, deliberate, and heading in their direction, and his grip tightened slightly on the thermal wrap as he looked back down at her, meeting those violet eyes again, now sharper, more focused despite the cold, as if she had felt it too, as if she had been waiting for it. And for the first time since he had found her, there was something else in her expression, something quieter, something almost resigned, and Ethan understood then, not fully, not yet, but enough to feel the weight of the choice settling in before he even made it, because whatever was coming, it was not coming to help. The signal grew stronger with each passing second, no longer a distant anomaly, but a steady presence pushing through the storm, and Ethan felt it in the subtle vibration beneath his boots as much as he saw it flickering across his display, a clean, repeating pattern that did not belong to anything abandoned or broken, and that alone told him everything he needed to know about what was coming. He moved quickly now, sliding one arm beneath Lyra's shoulders and the other under her legs, the thermal wrap tightening automatically around her form as he lifted her from the fractured ice, her weight lighter than he expected, but not fragile, not weak in the way her stillness suggested. And for a brief moment her hand caught at the front of his suit, fingers curling just enough to anchor herself as her eyes searched his visor again, more focused now, more aware, as if whatever strength remained in her had chosen this moment to surface. "You should leave," she said, her voice steadier, despite the cold that still clung to her skin, and Ethan shook his head once, already turning away from the exposed opening as he adjusted his route, angling toward the jagged rock formations 200 yards to the north where his scanners had marked a shallow ridge that might offer cover from both the wind and whatever was approaching. "Too late for that," he replied, his breath controlled, steps deliberate, each one calculated against the terrain as the storm thickened around them. The wind howled louder now, not just scraping but driving hard enough to push against his frame, forcing him to lean forward as his boots dug into the ice, servos in his suit compensating with a low mechanical hum. And still the signal followed, closing the distance with a precision that made his instincts tighten further, because nothing moved like that unless it was guided, unless it knew exactly where to go. Lyra shifted slightly in his arms, not struggling, not resisting, but adjusting, her gaze flicking past him toward the horizon as if she could see through the storm itself. And when she spoke again, there was something different in her tone, not resignation this time, but a quiet urgency. They will not stop. And Ethan did not need clarification, did not need names or titles or explanations, because the meaning was already clear in the way the signal tracked them, in the way the air itself seemed to tighten with its approach. Then we do not give them a straight path, he said, veering slightly off his original course, cutting across a field of uneven ice where cracks formed natural interference for most tracking systems, his suit recalculating with each step as he adjusted his pace to keep his balance without losing speed. And for a moment the only sound was the wind and the steady rhythm of his movement, the world narrowing down to distance, direction, and the weight in his arms that refused to be left behind. The ridge came into view through the storm, dark and jagged against the white expanse, and Ethan pushed harder, ignoring the warning flicker of his power reserves dipping lower than he liked. Because stopping was not an option, not now, not when whatever was coming had already closed more than half the gap. And as they reached the first line of rock, he dropped to one knee behind the natural cover, lowering Lyra carefully onto a patch of ground shielded from the worst of the wind as he turned his body slightly to block what remained, his hand already moving to adjust the output on his suit's emitter to create a localized heat field, small, temporary, but enough to buy her time. She watched him in silence for a moment, her breathing steadier now, color returning faintly to her skin beneath the cold sheen. And when she spoke again, her voice carried something quieter, something almost disbelieving. You are risking your life for someone you were taught to hate. And Ethan paused, just for a second, the words landing heavier than he expected as the past brushed too close for comfort. Images he had spent years burying pressing against the edges of his focus. But he did not let them take hold, did not let them change the decision already made, instead adjusting the final setting on the emitter before glancing back at her, his expression hidden behind the visor, but his voice steady all the same. Maybe I am tired of being told who deserves to be left behind. And the words settled between them, simple, unadorned, carrying more truth than he intended. And for the first time Lyra did not respond, did not question, only held his gaze as the storm roared around them, and the signal outside the ridge sharpened into something unmistakable, something close enough now that even without the display, he could feel it in the air, a presence waiting just beyond the rock. And Ethan shifted his stance slightly, placing himself between her and the direction of the approaching threat, not as a soldier, not as a hunter, but as something far simpler, something far more human, and he did not move. The ridge did not block the sound. It only shaped it, bending the distant hum into something more defined as it pressed against the rock like a slow, deliberate breath, and Ethan could feel it now through the thin layer of his suit. A low-frequency vibration that did not belong to wind or shifting ice. Something controlled, something patient, and that patience unsettled him more than anything fast or aggressive ever could. He adjusted his stance slightly, one knee anchored against the frozen ground while his other foot braced against the slope, keeping his balance as the storm surged around them, flakes of ice striking his visor in sharp, staccato bursts that blurred the edges of his vision. And still the signal held steady, just beyond the ridge, no longer closing but no longer distant either, as if whatever was out there had decided to stop and wait. Lyra's breathing had evened out behind him, the faint rhythm steady enough now that his suit no longer flagged it as critical, and he could feel her awareness in the quiet between sounds, the way her gaze remained fixed past him toward the unseen presence, not with fear, but with a recognition that carried its own weight. And when she spoke again, her voice was low, almost lost beneath the wind, but clear enough for the translator to catch. They know you will not leave. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, measured, because she was not guessing, she was stating a fact. And that meant whoever had sent the signal understood more than just her location. Then they are making assumptions, he replied. Though even as he said it, he knew that was only partly true, because he had already chosen, already crossed whatever line had existed between walking away and staying, and there was no going back from that. The display on his visor flickered again, resolving the interference into a clearer shape, a cluster of readings moving in tight formation just beyond the rock face, too organized to be natural, too precise to be random, and his fingers tightened slightly at his side as he ran through options, each one narrowing quickly under the reality of the situation, because he did not have the power reserves for a prolonged escape, and he did not have the information to predict what those readings represented, an uncertainty like that had cost him before. Behind him, Lyra shifted, not trying to rise, not testing the restraints, but turning her head slightly to follow his line of sight. And for the first time since he had found her, there was something else in her. Expression, not resignation, not urgency, but a quiet calculation that mirrored his own. And it struck him then that whatever she was, whatever role she had been forced into before this, she was not unfamiliar with being hunted. "You can still leave me," she said, her voice steady now, stronger than before, and Ethan shook his head without looking back. His focus fixed on the faint glow beginning to form through the storm just beyond the ridge, a soft distortion in the air that bent the falling ice around it, subtle but unmistakable. "That option expired a while ago," he answered, and there was no edge in his tone, no defiance, just a simple statement of fact. The glow intensified slightly, resolving into the outline of something hovering just out of sight, its presence marked more by the absence of wind in its immediate radius than by any visible structure. And Ethan felt the air shift as the storm itself seemed to hesitate, the chaotic motion of snow and ice disrupted by something that imposed its own order on the environment. And in that moment, the distance between them and whatever waited beyond the ridge felt smaller than it had any right to be. Lyra's voice came again, softer. This time, carrying a note that had not been there before, something almost human in its weight. "You do not understand what they will do." And Ethan closed his eyes briefly behind the visor, just for a second, letting the words settle without letting them take root, because understanding had never been a requirement for doing what he believed was right. Not before, not now. He opened them again, gaze steady, posture unchanged, as he shifted slightly to better shield her from the direction of the disturbance, his body a barrier against something he could not yet fully see. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet but certain. "Then they will have to deal with me first." And the words hung there, simple, unembellished, as the glow beyond the ridge sharpened into something more defined, the faint outline of a presence preparing to reveal itself. And the storm, for the first time since he had stepped onto this world, seemed to fall silent. The silence did not last. It shifted, like the world itself was holding its breath before something inevitable stepped forward. And then the glow beyond the ridge condensed into form, not with a sudden movement, but with a quiet precision that made the air feel tighter, heavier, as if space itself had been adjusted to allow its presence. And Ethan's visor struggled for a second before locking onto it, outlining a sleek structure hovering just above the ice, its surface reflecting nothing, absorbing light instead of casting it, edges too smooth, too deliberate to belong to anything natural. He did not raise his weapon, did not step forward. He simply stood there, grounded, unmoving, his body placed between Lyra and whatever had come for her. And that alone seemed to be enough to trigger the next change as a section of the hovering form unfolded with a soft, controlled motion, revealing figures within, tall, still, their silhouettes sharp against the dim glow behind them. And even without full visual clarity, Ethan could tell they were not searching, not scanning. They were observing, waiting. The wind did not touch them. The storm bent around their presence as if it recognized something it could not disrupt, and that unnatural calm made every instinct in Ethan tighten, because nothing that controlled the environment like that operated on chance. Behind him, Lyra's voice came again, quieter now, but carrying something deeper, something almost familiar. "They will speak first." And there was no fear in her tone, only certainty, as if this moment had always been part of the path she had already accepted. Ethan shifted his stance slightly, adjusting his footing on the ice, his suit compensating with a faint mechanical hum, while his eyes remained fixed on the figures ahead, watching for movement, for any sign of intent beyond observation. And then it came, not as sound carried through air, but as a vibration that passed through his suit and settled directly into his perception, translated instantly by the system into words that did not belong to any human voice. "Return the subject," the presence said, calm, measured, without urgency or aggression. And that absence of force made it more unsettling, not less, because it assumed compliance as if it were the only logical outcome. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound steady inside his helmet as he glanced briefly back at Lyra, just enough to confirm what he already suspected, that she recognized them, that she understood this exchange far better than he did. And when he looked forward again, his voice came through his external speaker, clear and controlled. "She is not an object you get to reclaim." And the words felt simple, almost too simple against something that operated on a different scale. But they were enough, because they were his. The figures did not move immediately, but the glow around them shifted slightly, a subtle recalibration as if processing a variable that did not fit the expected pattern, and the response came again, just as calm, just as certain. You are not part of this equation, human. And Ethan almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it confirmed what he had already decided, that this was not about logic, not about systems or orders or whatever structure they followed. It was about a choice, and he had already made his. He adjusted his position again, just enough to make his intent unmistakable, placing himself fully in their line, not as a threat, not as an aggressor, but as something they had not accounted for, something that did not fit. And behind him, he could feel Lyra watching, not just observing now, but understanding, the quiet shift in her breathing matching the change in the air as the moment stretched between two sides that saw the world in entirely different ways. The presence paused, not retreating, not advancing, simply holding. And in that stillness, Ethan realized something that settled deeper than the cold ever could, that whatever they were, whatever power they carried, they had expected obedience, not resistance. And for the first time since they arrived, that expectation had been broken, not by force, not by strategy, but by something far simpler, something they had not prepared for. And in that narrow space between what was expected and what had actually happened, everything began to change. The pause stretched long enough to feel intentional, not hesitation but evaluation, as if the presence before him was recalculating variables that had never been part of its design. And Ethan could almost feel that process unfolding in the subtle shifts of light along the vessel's surface, the way the glow dimmed and brightened in controlled intervals, each pulse measured, deliberate, and entirely detached from the urgency that should have existed in a retrieval like this. Behind him, Lyra drew a slower breath, steadier now, the warmth from the emitter holding against the cold as her voice came again, softer but carrying a weight that had not been there before. They will not force you. And that made Ethan glance back for just a fraction of a second, enough to catch the change in her expression, not fear, not even resignation this time, but something closer to understanding, as if she had seen this pattern before, as if she knew the rules they were following even if he did not. He turned forward again just as the presence responded, the vibration settling into his suit with the same calm precision. Compliance is expected, not enforced. And the words landed with a quiet certainty that made the air feel colder, because it was not a threat, it was a statement of structure, of a system that assumed alignment without resistance. Ethan let out a slow breath, his shoulders steady, posture unchanged, as he processed that, because it told him something important, something critical, that whatever authority stood beyond that ridge did not operate on coercion. It operated on inevitability, on the assumption that every element in its reach would eventually fall into place. And that assumption had already failed. Then your system has a flaw, he said, his voice even, not raised, not aggressive, just present. And for the first time the glow shifted more noticeably, a subtle distortion rippling across the surface of the craft, as if the statement itself had introduced something unfamiliar into its calculations. The figures within remained still, but the air between them and the ridge grew sharper, the boundary more defined, and Ethan could feel it like a pressure against his suit. Not physical, not forceful, but insistent, as if something was attempting to assess him beyond what sensors alone could measure. Lyra's voice followed, quieter, directed more at him than at them. They do not understand deviation. And that word lingered. Deviation, something outside the expected path, something that did not align with predetermined outcomes. And Ethan almost smiled again, not out of humor, but recognition, because he had spent most of his life being exactly that. The presence responded once more, the vibration slightly altered now, carrying a faint shift in tone that suggested adjustment rather than repetition. Human, your actions are statistically inconsistent with survival optimization. And Ethan let out a short breath at that, shaking his head slightly as he shifted his footing on the ice, grounding himself against the ridge while the storm continued to swirl beyond the invisible boundary. Yeah, he said quietly. That sounds about right. Because survival had never been the only metric he followed. Not anymore, not. After everything that had taught him the cost of choosing the easy path over the right one. The silence that followed was different this time. Not empty, not waiting, but processing. And in that space, Ethan realized something else, something that settled deeper than the cold ever could, that this was not just about Lyra, not just about retrieval or control or whatever system governed them. This was about a variable they had not accounted for, a decision that did not fit their model. And that meant one thing. That meant they had to adapt or withdraw. because those were the only options left when certainty broke. Behind him, Lyra shifted slightly, her gaze no longer fixed on the figures but on him, studying him with a quiet intensity that held more questions than words. And for the first time since he had found her, there was something else in her eyes, something warmer, something that did not belong to fear or calculation, and he did not look back, did not need to, because he could feel it in the space between them, that something had already changed. The glow beyond the ridge dimmed slightly, the figures within becoming less defined as the vessel adjusted its position by a fraction, not retreating, not advancing, simply recalibrating, and the presence spoke one final time. The vibration softer now, but no less clear. Outcome divergence acknowledged. And then the pressure in the air eased, just enough to signal a shift, not an end, but a transition, and Ethan remained where he was, steady, unmoving, because whatever came next, it would not follow the path they had expected. The pressure in the air did not disappear completely. It thinned, like something vast had stepped back just far enough to observe from a different angle, and Ethan remained exactly where he was. One foot grounded against the ridge, shoulders squared against the cold that had begun to creep back in as the artificial calm faded. The storm reclaiming its territory with a low, restless hiss. The glow beyond the rock dimmed further, not vanishing but withdrawing into a tighter form, the figures inside becoming silhouettes once more, distant and unreadable. And yet the sense of being watched did not lessen. It sharpened, more focused now, more deliberate, as if attention had shifted from the situation to the choice itself. Behind him, Lyra moved again, slowly this time, her body adjusting against the thermal wrap as she pushed herself up just enough to sit, the restraints at her wrists catching the faint light with a dull reflection, and Ethan heard the subtle change in her breathing, stronger now, steadier, the edge of survival no longer immediate, but not forgotten either. "They are learning you," she said quietly, and there was no uncertainty in her voice, only a calm acknowledgement that made Ethan's gaze narrow slightly as he kept his focus forward. "That makes two of us," he replied. Because whatever system they followed, whatever logic defined them, it was not something he intended to simply accept without question. The storm shifted direction, wind cutting across the ridge at a sharper angle now, forcing Ethan to brace again as his suit adjusted power distribution, a faint warning flickering at the edge of his display, reminding him that time was still a factor, that standing here indefinitely was not an option no matter how this exchange unfolded. The presence responded. Once more, but this time the vibration carried something new, not just information, not just command, but curiosity, subtle, restrained, but unmistakable. "Human Ethan Cole," it said, the use of his name landing with a quiet weight that made his jaw tighten beneath the helmet. Because he had not given it, had not offered anything beyond his refusal, and yet it had been acquired, processed, integrated. "Your decision deviates from predictive models," the voice continued, calm as ever, but now, with a faint undercurrent of analysis, and Ethan let out a slow breath, not surprised, not really, because if they could track Lyra across a frozen world, then identifying him was just another variable to resolve. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "I get that a lot." And there was no sarcasm in it, no attempt to provoke, just a simple acceptance of what he was and had always been, something that did not fit neatly into systems designed for efficiency. Behind him, Lyra's gaze shifted fully onto him now, studying him with a quiet intensity that held more than curiosity, something deeper, something that had begun to take shape the moment he chose not to walk away. And for the first time her voice carried a note that did not belong to calculation or strategy. "You are not what they expected," she said, softer now, and Ethan did not turn, did not need to, because the truth of that statement was already evident in the way the air itself seemed to hesitate around him. The presence remained silent for a moment, longer this time, the vessel's glow stabilizing into a steady, low intensity that suggested a shift in purpose. And when it spoke again, the words were measured, deliberate, each one placed with precision. "Outcome revision in progress." And the phrase echoed faintly in Ethan's mind as he processed it. Not a retreat, not a surrender, but an adjustment, a recalibration of something far larger than this single moment. The storm intensified again, wind driving harder against the ridge, snow swirling in tighter patterns as if trying to reclaim dominance over a space that had briefly been controlled by something else. And Ethan felt the cold press in once more, real, physical, grounding, a reminder that whatever was happening beyond the ridge, this world still followed its own rules. He shifted slightly, glancing back just enough to meet Lyra's eyes for the first time since the exchange began, and there was something there now that had not existed before, not just awareness, not just understanding, but recognition, as if she had crossed a threshold in her own perception, seeing him not as an anomaly, not as a tool or an obstacle, but as something entirely different. Neither of them spoke for a moment, the silence between them filled only by the wind and the distant hum of the vessel. And in that quiet, Ethan realized that the balance had already shifted, not in a way that could be measured or predicted, but in something far more subtle, something that existed in the space between action and intention, and whatever came next, it would not be the same as what had been planned. The storm pressed harder now, reclaiming the space that had briefly belonged to something else, and Ethan felt the cold settle back into the edges of his suit as the emitter behind him flickered once, then stabilized, its output dropping just enough to remind him that nothing here was permanent. Not the warmth, not the silence, not even the fragile pause that had formed between two opposing forces. The vessel beyond the ridge remained where it was, no longer advancing, no longer asserting control, but not leaving either, its presence reduced yet undeniable, like a question that had not been answered, only reframed. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the ice crunching beneath his boot as he turned just enough to fully face Lyra now, his body no longer blocking her view but still positioned close enough to shield her from the worst of the wind. And for a moment he simply looked at her, really looked, past the frost still clinging to her skin, past the restraints that marked her as something controlled, something contained, and saw the steadiness in her gaze, the clarity that had returned now that survival was no longer slipping away second by second. "You said they would not force me," he said quietly, his voice steady through the external speaker, and she nodded. Once, a small movement but deliberate, her eyes never leaving his. "They believe force is inefficient," she replied, her voice calm, almost reflective now, as if she were explaining something that had once seemed absolute but no longer felt that way. "They expect alignment, eventually." And Ethan let out a slow breath at that, glancing briefly back toward the ridge where the faint glow still lingered, still watching, still waiting for something to resolve. "And if alignment never happens?" he asked, not because he needed the answer, but because he wanted to hear how she would define it now, after everything that had just unfolded. And Lyra was quiet for a moment, her gaze shifting slightly, not away from him but inward, as if the question reached somewhere deeper than the surface, somewhere that had been fixed for a long time and was now beginning to shift. "Then the system changes," she said finally, softer now. And there was something in her tone that carried more than logic, more than structure, something closer to belief, and Ethan felt that settle in a way the cold never could, because it meant this was not just about survival anymore, not just about escaping what had come for her. It was about something larger, something that had begun the moment he refused to step aside. The wind surged again, louder now, carrying fine shards of ice that struck his visor in rapid bursts, forcing him to adjust his stance once more as his suit compensated, the power readout dipping another fraction, a quiet reminder that whatever came next would have to happen soon. Behind him, the emitter flickered again, weaker this time, and Lyra's eyes followed the movement, understanding passing through them in a way that needed no translation. "You cannot stay here," she said, her voice steady but firm, and Ethan nodded once, because she was right, because this place was not meant for either of them to linger, not with the storm, not with the presence still observing just beyond the ridge. He reached down, adjusting the thermal wrap around her shoulders, securing it tighter against the cold before sliding one arm beneath her again, lifting her carefully but with purpose this time. No hesitation left in the movement, and she did not resist, did not question, only held onto the front of his suit as he rose, her grip stronger now, more certain. As he turned away from the ridge, angling back toward the distant outline of his ship barely visible through the storm, the glow behind them shifted once more, dimming further, receding not in retreat but in acknowledgement, and the voice came one last time, softer than before, carrying a tone that had not existed when it first arrived. "Observation continues." And then it faded, not gone, but distant, no longer pressing against the moment. Ethan did not look back, did not slow his pace as he moved forward into the storm, each step deliberate, each breath steady. And behind him Lyra rested against him, her gaze no longer fixed on the presence they had left behind, but on something ahead, something uncertain but no longer defined by fear. And in that quiet shift, something irreversible had already taken root, not in the system that had come for her, but in the space between them, where choice had rewritten expectation and nothing would follow the same path again. The storm did not ease as they moved. It followed, pressing against Ethan's back like a constant reminder that this world did not forgive hesitation, and each step toward the faint silhouette of his ship felt heavier than the last, not from the weight in his arms, but from the quiet understanding that something had already changed in a way he could not undo. His suit warned him again, a soft pulse at the edge of his vision indicating diminishing reserves, the temperature difference narrowing as the emitter's support faded behind them, and still he kept his pace steady, deliberate, because stopping was no longer an option, not with distance still ahead and the cold closing in again. Lyra remained still against him, not weak now but conserving, her grip firm where it rested against his chest, her breathing aligned with his in a quiet rhythm that spoke of awareness rather than survival. And after a long stretch of silence her voice came again, softer than before, but clearer, no strain left in it. You chose a path that cannot be reversed, and Ethan let out a slow breath, the words settling without resistance, because he already knew that, had known at the moment he broke the ice and reached for her instead of walking away. Yeah, he said quietly. I figured that out back there. And there was no regret in it, only a simple acknowledgement of consequence. The shape of the ship grew clearer through the storm, its dark frame barely visible against the shifting white as its automated beacon pulsed faintly, a small, steady light that cut through the chaos just enough to guide him forward. And as he approached, the hatch responded to his proximity, releasing with a soft mechanical hiss that sounded almost out of place against the raw noise of the wind. He stepped inside without hesitation, the door sealing behind him with a final, solid thud that cut off the storm in an instant, leaving only the low hum of internal systems and the controlled warmth of the cabin air as it began to circulate again. For a moment, he did not move, standing there in the narrow entryway with Lyra still in his arms as the silence settled around them. Real silence this time, not imposed, not shaped, just present, and it felt different, heavier in a way. That had nothing to do with the cold. He lowered her carefully onto the nearest seat, the thermal wrap still secured around her as he stepped back just enough to give her space, removing his helmet with a slow motion that released a faint cloud of breath into the warmer air, his hair damp, his expression steady but tired in a way that ran deeper than physical strain. Lyra watched him closely now, not as an observer, not as someone assessing a variable, but as someone trying to understand something entirely new. And when she spoke again, her voice carried that shift fully, no distance left in it. They will come again. And Ethan nodded once, because that part had never been in question, because systems that large did not abandon outcomes. They adjusted, recalculated, and returned. Then we will deal with it when they do, he replied, simple, direct, as he moved toward the control panel, initiating startup sequences with practiced motions, the ship responding with a rising hum as systems came online one by one, light returning to the displays, navigation stabilizing, a path forming out of the chaos outside. Lyra's gaze followed him, then shifted briefly to the sealed hatch behind them, as if she could still feel the presence that had watched from beyond the ridge. And when she looked back at him, there was something else in her eyes now, something that did not belong to duty or survival or even understanding, but something quieter, something that had begun in the moment. He chose not to leave her behind. You changed their equation, she said, almost to herself, and Ethan paused for just a second, his hand resting on the controls as he considered that, not in terms of systems or outcomes, but in something far simpler, something he had always held on to even when everything else fell apart. He glanced back at her, meeting her gaze without hesitation, and his voice, when it came, was quiet but certain. No, he said, I just made my choice, and the ship lifted. Slowly, the ground falling away beneath them as the storm swallowed the ridge, the ice, and whatever had been waiting there, leaving only the echo of a moment that would not be forgotten, not by the system that had observed it, and not by the two lives that had been changed by it. Outside, the stars waited beyond the storm, distant and steady, and inside, in the quiet space between them, something new had taken shape, not defined by logic or command, but by a simple truth that did not need explanation, that in a universe built on power and prediction, one human decision had been enough to create something neither side had expected. And for the first time, it was not uncertainty that filled the silence, but possibility.